Right, I'm going to do a little tutorial, quite a long tutorial it'll be by the end, of some basic knitting skills, whatever you want to call them, techniques. I'm going to show you how to hold your needle and your yarn, how to cast on, how to do a knit stitch, which will give you a garter pattern, how to do purl stitch so that you can alternate knit stitch with purl stitch to make a stocking stitch pattern, how to alternate them in a different way to do a rib stitch, and yet another way of alternating knit and purl to do a stocking stitch. And then I'm going to show you how to make holes on purpose. Very easy to make holes not on purpose. How to decrease to make a raglan edge. How to increase to make a gathered effect. And then finally, how to cast off. Very important. You've made a whole jumper and you don't know how to cast off. That's no good. So here we go. I'm going to show you how to hold your needles and your yarn and cast on for knitting. There are several methods for doing this, and some people have their own methods. This is the way I find easiest. I'm not a great knitter. I do mostly crochet, but when I do knit, this is how I do it. There's a bit of muck on my fingernail there. So you've got your slip knot, pop it on your needle, get your cut end to the left and your ball end of the yarn to the right. Hold your left hand needle with your hand on top of it, and your right hand needle with your hand underneath as if you're going to write. You need to wrap the yarn round your fingers of your right hand so you've got some control over the yarn. And to do this, I take my little finger underneath and wrap it round my little finger, then underneath my ring finger, over my middle finger, and then you can use your forefinger, your index finger, to hook the yarn over your needle. Do that again. Little finger underneath and wrap it round. Turn your hand over your ring finger, underneath your middle finger, and use your forefinger for hooking the yarn over. If you curl your little finger round like that, it'll hold the yarn taut for when you're hooking over with your forefinger. And then when you need to pull the yarn through, just let your little finger go and it'll pull through easily. Okay? So wrap it round, over that one, under that one, and insert, whoops, drop my needle, insert your right hand needle into the stitch and underneath your left hand needle. As I said, curl your little finger round, that'll just hold it taut while you do this. Over, and pull it through and hook it on. Now when you normally do knitting, when you're doing your main rows, you would insert your needle into that stitch. But for casting on, we go in between the two needles, and that gives you a much neater edge. So insert your hook between the two stitches. Use your forefinger to hook it over, pull it through, and then pop it on that left hand needle. Keep doing that in between the two, over the needle, pull it through, hook it on. Casting on can be a bit tedious, but once you've done it you'll be away. Try not to make them too tight, you'll have trouble on the next row and you'll have a very tight hem at the bottom and it'll pucker up a bit, so don't keep them fairly loose. A bit of experience will show you just how much. You'll start getting your tension right. When you first learn to knit you'll be all over the place and have big stitches and little stitches, but with practice you'll get them all the same. So you cast on as many as you need and you're ready to knit. There's two basic stitches in knitting, and that is the knit stitch and the purl stitch. If you do your work all with knit stitch you get a garter stitch. If you do all your rows using purl stitch you will also get a garter stitch. But when you start alternating knit and purl, that's when you get the different patterns. You can do rib and stocking stitch and stuff like that. But we're just going to show you the garter stitch using a knit stitch first. So you've cast on, insert your hook. Now when you're casting on you inserted your hook, I'm so used to crochet, your needle in between the two stitches. But when you start actually knitting rows you insert your hook, still saying hook, needle into the stitch itself, underneath the left hand needle. Hook your yarn over, and this time when you're casting on you would put that onto the needle, but this time you push that old stitch off, and again. I'm just turning it over so you can see. Into that stitch, wrap the yarn round the needle and pull it through, and then knock that old stitch off. Into the stitch on your left hand needle, wrap the yarn round, pull it through, knock that stitch off. Into the stitch, wrap it round, pull it through, knock it off. We used to say when I was at school, in, over, through, off. In, over, through, off. In, over, through, off. And you carry on right to the end. In, over, through, off. 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 And into the last one, in, over, through, off, and then you simply swap hands. So you put your right hand needle into your left hand needle into your right hand, wrap the yarn round your right hand again, and do the same again. In, over, through, off. Keep doing that row after row, and you'll get a garter stitch. garter stitch is nice and stretchy. It stays nice and flat. It's a good stitch for making scarves. Okay. Swap hands again. Wrap it round your fingers. In, over, through, off. In, over, through, off. I'm not a fast knitter, I'm not a great knitter. I can knit. You'll probably end up doing better than me. Lots slower than crochet, and also with knitting it's very easy to, if you do drop a stitch, it's quite difficult to get your stitches back on the needle again. With crochet you don't have that problem, but you do get a much tighter fabric than with crochet. And then you get this nice stretchy garter stitch fabric. In, over, through, off, in, over, through, off, in, I'll just do that slowly again, in, over, through, off, in, over, through, off, in, over, through, off. And as you're knitting and this gets a bit longer, you just hook your thumb up over your underneath your fabric and hold it all in your hand there. There you go. Quite stretchy. So I've done a few rows there of garter stitch using a knit stitch. You can also do garter stitch using a purl stitch. With knit stitch, you put your needle in that way, and as you knit and you throw the stitch off, the stitch ends up on the far side of your work. A purl stitch is just doing it the opposite way. So take your needle underneath there and insert it backwards into the stitch so that your needle is on top. Your right hand needle is on top of your left hand needle this time. Wrap your yarn underneath the needle, over the top, and hook it through that way and pull that stitch off. And again, underneath the needle, hook it through, pull it off. And this time you'll notice that unlike garter stitch, where the stitch is thrown over to the other side of your work, this takes the stitch to the side facing you. And you'll get the same effect as with knit stitch. You'll end up with that nice stretchy garter stitch. Now if you want to do stocking stitch, if you want a nice smooth surface instead of all bumpy like this, you alternate one row of purl, one row knit, one row purl, one row knit. That way the stitches all get thrown to the same side. So this is getting thrown towards me. Thrown, I don't know quite how else to describe it other than thrown. Placed. And then you get this smooth fabric on one side. I'll just do another knit row. You'll be able to see that more clearly. So stitches go over to the back. Over to the back. You'll see when I get to the end of this row, it's starting to get a smooth fabric instead of all the bumps, and all the stitches have been thrown to the back, so on the back side you'll get this rougher fabric on the back, nice and smooth on the front. And if I do another row of purl stitch, take your needle underneath the yarn, in through the other way, wrap your hook over, so your needle's on top of your left hand needle, underneath and over, pull it through, and your stitch ends up on the side towards you. So they always, when you do alternate rows of knit stitch and purl stitch, the stitches all end up on the same side, leaving you with a nice smooth fabric on the other side. Not so good for scarves this, because the tension tends to pull the fabric, curling it round at the edges, and you end up with it all rolled up like a tube. So it's not quite so good for scarves, but very nice for jumpers. The last one, turn it round. You see, there's me a couple of rows of garter stitch there. Then you get this nice smooth stocking stitch fabric, and on the other side it's more textured. Now you can alternate knit stitch and purl stitch to get what you call a rib, which is used on the welts. Nice stretchy fabric, stretches that way very nicely for cuffs and welts on jumpers. Also quite good for a nice thick scarf. To alternate knit and purl, I find a little bit annoying. Not everyone likes doing rib stitch because it takes so much longer. Do a knit stitch in through that way, hook it over. Now your yarn's on the wrong side to do a purl stitch, because if you're going from the back, then your yarn's in the wrong place. So in between stitches you've got to pull the yarn over to the side you're going to knit. So do a purl stitch, then you have to take the yarn back again to do your knit stitch. Bring your yarn back here to do your purl stitch, back through there. So it takes twice as long really to do a rib stitch, because you have this extra movement with the yarn in between every stitch. Knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. Now remember what your last stitch was. The last stitch on the row was a knit stitch. So if your last one was a knit stitch, on the next row you've got to make that a purl stitch. If your last stitch was a purl stitch, then your first stitch on your next line must be a knit stitch. So our last one was a knit stitch, so we start with a purl stitch. Oops. So it's in through backwards for your purl stitch. Wrap it round, pull it through. Next one's a knit stitch. Knit, purl, knit, purl, and carry on like that to the end of the row, and you do the same on every row, making a note of what your last stitch was and do the opposite on the first stitch of the next row. Carry on doing that row after row. So I've done several rows now, or several, about 4. Just get to the end of this row. Purl 1, knit 1, whoops, purl 1, I'll just turn that round. You can see this nice stretchy rib starting to form there. There's my garter stitch, there's my stocking stitch, there's my rib stitch. Just by doing knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 all along the row. And wherever you did a knit stitch on the previous row, you do a purl stitch on the next row. So there's my little samples of garter stitch, stocking stitch and rib stitch, which I've shown you on other videos, if you'd like to take a look at those. And now I'm going to show you how to do moss stitch, which is almost the same as rib stitch. And on rib stitch you looked at the last stitch, and the last stitch you did on that row was a purl stitch. And with rib stitch that would mean that your first stitch would be a knit stitch. But with moss stitch, you look at your last stitch and it was a purl stitch, and you do exactly the same stitch for your first stitch on the next row. So you do a purl stitch there, take your yarn to the other side and do a knit stitch, and a purl stitch, knit. So it's knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, the same, but instead of knitting where there's a purl and purling where there was a knit, this time you do a purl where there was a purl and a knit where there was a knit. The purl stitch there and a knit stitch all the way along that row. A bit faster, I'm not very fast knitter. Knit, purl, knit. So your last stitch is a purl stitch, so that means your first stitch on the next row will also be a purl stitch. Purl, knit. You keep doing that, and it's quite a pretty stitch, quite often used in Aran. Nice textured stitch. So that's what you end up with. There's garter stitch, stocking stitch, rib stitch and moss stitch at the top there. Sometimes with knitting you need to make a little hole completely on purpose as part of the pattern, usually incorporated into lacy stitches. I'm just going to show you how to make a little hole. I've done a little bit of stocking stitch there, which is knit one row, purl one row. And I've done a couple of stitches on that row. To make a little hole, you usually see the abbreviation yarn forward or yarn back, and all they're telling you to do is bring the yarn to the other side, and then it will say slip one, so you slip one onto the next needle, that's slip one, knit one. Now as you knit, because your yarn's been brought forward to this side, when you take it over, it will make an extra stitch because it will wrap over the needle. So you've slipped one, knit one, and then it'll say pass the slip stitch over. So there's the one you've knitted, there's the one you slipped, so you pass that one over the one you've just knitted, like that. So you've got rid of that stitch, but you've replaced it where you brought the yarn over the needle. I'll do a couple more stitches and show you that again. Yarn forward, slip one, knit one, and as you knit one you notice that yarn will go over the top of the needle before you take it round and make an extra stitch there, and then you pass that slip stitch over the one you just knitted. A couple more, and again yarn forward, slip one, knit one, pass the slip stitch over. So you've decreased there really by one stitch, but you've added another one here. And just knit to the end there. Now the next row is going to be a purl row, because we're doing this in stocking stitch. And as you look along, you can see the places where you brought the yarn forward and made an extra stitch. There, and there, and there. So we're going to purl on this row, because we're doing stocking stitch. Okay, like that. And then we come to the place where we've got this yarn that's gone over the needle there, and we purl into that, and that's where you get your little hole. I'll see that in a minute when I finish the row. There's the next one. We purl into that, and that'll leave a little hole there. Carry on. Come to that last one. There it is. Purl into that. To the end. And of course we're going to knit the next row because we're doing stocking stitch. Knit a row, purl a row. You can see there where those little holes are. And they'll show up a bit better after I've finished this row. stitches. Okay, there they are. So that's if you want to incorporate little holes, or indeed it's one way of doing a buttonhole. So now I'm going to show you how to decrease. I've done garter stitch, stocking stitch, rib, moss stitch, and then I showed you how to make holes for patterns or buttonholes. There's two ways to decrease. You can either slip your stitch, knit one, and pass the slip stitch over, or you can knit two stitches together. Now there are uses for these two in different places, because if you do the slip stitch version, your stitch that you decrease will lean to the left. If you knit two together, it will lean to the right. So if you'd say doing a jumper and you wanted to decrease both sides for a raglan shape, or for the sleeve, so that your work will decrease like that at an angle, you want the stitches on this side to lean that way and the stitches on that side to lean that way, to the right. You'll see what I mean as I'm doing it. And usually a pattern will ask you to do one or two plain stitches to start with. It just gives you a nice neat edge. So I'm just going to do two there, slip one stitch, knit one stitch, pass the slip stitch over. Carry on knitting to the end until you've got 3 stitches left. Bear with me, I'm not a very quick knitter. Right, I've got 3 stitches there at the end. Insert your needle into both of the next 2 stitches and knit them together. Oh, I've done that wrong, haven't I? Sorry. There should be you do it until there's I'm just going to do that. Sorry. 4 stitches left. Silly me. Knit those 2 together. And then knit the last 2. You can see I'm not a very good knitter, but I do know what I'm doing. Right, and then you purl the next row as normal. Right, so I've done that purl row. Now I'm going to decrease on the knit row again. Knit 2. Decrease in the next 2 stitches, so slip 1, knit 1, pass that slip stitch over. Keep knitting until you've got 4 stitches left at the end. Go on. Knit those 2 together. These are kiddies knitting needles and they're all bendy. Insert your needle into both of those stitches together and knit them together. And then knit your last 2. And purl the next row, and you keep doing that until you've decreased as much as you need to. You can see there what I mean about them leaning On that side they're leaning to the left, and that side they're leaning to the right. That's what you end up with. Oh dear, frog in my throat. That's what you end up with. Nice raglan shaped, with all the stitches leaning in the right direction. Okay, here's my little sample, and I've done garter stitch, stocking stitch, rib, moss stitch, holes, and decreasing. Now to increase, you need to work into one stitch twice. So I'm just going to do one plain stitch. And I'm going to increase all along this row. So you knit as normal into your stitch, but don't knock it off the needle. Okay, you're going to take your needle round and over, and then into the back of the stitch, and knit again, and then you've got 2 stitches where there was 1. Do that again for you. Into the front, into the back, and then push it off the needle. Into the front. Don't slip it off your needle yet. Take your needle round and into the back. And again, into the front, into the back, and then slip it off. Do one more, into the front, knit into the front, take your needle over, knit into the back, and then we'll just do one ordinary knit stitch at the end there. And you turn it round and you purl your row, just purl it straight. You could increase on this one if you wanted to. If you're increasing with the purl stitch, you'd have to knit into the back first, or purl into the back I should say, into the back of that stitch, and then into the front of that stitch. Okay. It's a bit fiddly on a purl row. It's quite hard to get your needle in. Into the back. Then into the front. I'm just going to purl all the way to the end, so I've quadrupled then the number of stitches that I've got on my needle. So I've got to the end of the row now, into the back of that stitch, into the front of that stitch, into the back of that stitch, whoops, sorry I went off screen then, and into the front, and then just purl the last one as you normally would. And then you go back into stocking stitch. Knit a row, purl a row. So there's your gathered effect. Right, how to cast off knitting, very simple to do. Knit your first stitch, knit your second stitch. Now I must confess to something here. I've already videoed this once, and when I came to view it, it was full of all sorts of background noises, hissing and stuff, so I had to undo it again. So I've got all the stitches back on again, and some of them are on back to front. So let's try again. So you knit one, knit another, go to the first one, pull it over the second one and off the needle. Knit another one, that one's on back to front as well. Knit another one. Whoopsie daisy. And again, knit another one. Pick it up over the other stitch and drop it off the needle. And again, excuse me, I'm going into the back of these stitches because they're on back to front. Normally you'd go like that. Oh, well, I can go like that just to show you. Doesn't matter, I'm not going to use this for anything. Just keep going like that, right to the end. Knit one, pass the previous one over. Can't get that in, there you go. Knit one, pass that over. Knit one, pass that over. Knit one. I've put all these on back to front, so I'm going into the back of the stitch, but you can get the gist of it. You're clever. I know you're clever. Knit one, knit one. I'm sure to come to a point here where I started putting them on a different way around. So in a minute, hopefully. I don't know. Pass it over. Keep doing that. And as you can see, get this nice neat edge. If you're doing stocking stitch and you've just finished with a knit row and your next row is for casting off, then you should cast off using purl stitch. Here we are, they're all on the right way round now. If you're doing a rib stitch, then you cast off in rib stitch. So you'd knit a stitch, purl a stitch, pass it over. Knit a stitch, pass it over. Purl a stitch, pass it over. Knit. So you always cast off using the stitch pattern that you've used throughout your garment. Nearly to the end. Just a few more to go, and then what to do when you get to the end. That's on back to front. I'm not much use to you, really. I'm not a great knitter, I must confess. And then you get to your last stitch. Oh, what have I done? Silly me. Pass that over. Do you know, I've not even been watching to see if this is in view on the video. I'm looking at my hands. Right, you get to the last one. Pass that over. You've still got a stitch there. Now what you do with that is you cut off. I've already cut it off because, as I told you, I've already done this once and had to unpick it. So you cut it off from your ball of yarn. And just, there's several ways you could do this. You could use a crochet hook to pull it through. You could just stuff it through with your fingers. Or you could wind the yarn over your needle and pass that, I don't know, just as long as you get that end through that loop. That's all you need to do, whatever method you find easiest. And pull it tight, and that's you done.